Imani Rhodes stepped into that courtroom as just another black woman fighting to defend her brother. But when Judge Griggs sneered, "People like you don't belong here," he had no idea who he was provoking. What he saw was a woman in plain clothes. What he didn't see was her past as a former FBI agent, or the warrant already in motion. She didn't come to argue. She came to end the game. But how do you bring down a judge without raising your voice? Like, comment your thoughts and subscribe to follow stories that reveal the power behind silence. Let's begin. They say courtrooms are cold because of the air conditioning. That's a lie. It's not the vents. It's the silence. The kind that holds judgment long before a verdict is ever spoken. At exactly 9:02 a.m., the double doors opened with a dull creak and Imani Rhodes walked in. No entourage. No heels. No makeup. Just a long navy blue coat shoes that didn't make a sound, and the quiet kind of presence that unsettled people without them knowing why. She didn't look like someone who belonged at the defense table, and judging by the way the room stiffened, no one thought she did either. As she passed the gallery, heads turned, but not out of respect. They watched her like a stranger in the wrong neighborhood. Darius sat alone at the defendant's table, hands cuffed, eyes low. When Imani took the empty seat beside him, a security officer immediately stepped forward, face tightening like he'd been waiting for this. "Ma'am," he said sharply, hand hovering near his belt, "you can't sit there unless you're licensed counsel. Identification now." Imani didn't flinch. She opened her folder slowly, deliberately, and held out a folded document. The officer unfolded it, read, and paused. His jaw twitched. He looked up, confused, not because the paper was unclear, but because it was valid. "Stay put," he muttered, turning on his heel and walking straight to the bench. Judge Walter Griggs didn't look up right away. He knew someone had entered. He heard the shift in the room, but he waited, deliberately. Then, without lifting his eyes, he said, "We allow public observers, not participants." The officer leaned in, handed him the paper, whispered something. That's when Griggs looked up. His eyes landed on Imani and stayed there, studying her, not like a person, like a problem. He chuckled. "Well now. Representing the accused, are we?" He adjusted his robe and leaned back. "Self-represented defense, Your Honor." He shook his head slowly, then looked back at the courtroom. "I love these. Always a fun show." A few people behind Imani chuckled. Quiet, but not quiet enough. She didn't look at them. She looked at him. "Is there a problem with the paperwork?" she asked calmly. Griggs smiled without warmth, only with expectations. He raised the paper. "Miss Rhodes, is it? Are you aware this is a felony case that your brother could be sentenced to a decade behind bars?" "I am," she replied. "And you intend to act as counsel?" "I do." He scoffed. "Miss Rhodes, this isn't a community center dispute. This is a court of law, a real one." Now Darius looked up. His sister didn't move, but her voice sharpened just slightly. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I'm well aware of the law." Griggs leaned forward. "Knowing the law and practicing it are two very different things." She met his gaze head on. "I've done both." There was a pause, a shift in the air, just a half-second too long. Griggs broke it by slapping the file folder shut and grumbling, "Let's just hope your little courtroom experiment doesn't waste our time." That was when the man in the back row dark suit expression like stone wrote something down in his notepad. Just one line. Darius whispered, "You don't have to do this, Imani." She turned slightly to him, not taking her eyes off the bench. "I do." The judge rapped his gavel. "Let's begin." But something had already begun long before he lifted that gavel. Something none of them saw coming. Something he would never be able to stop. The prosecutor stood slowly like someone who already knew how this would end. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Every step he took was measured, practiced, rehearsed in rooms just like this. And when he spoke, it was with that casual authority that sounds polite, but lands heavy. "Your Honor," he said, facing the bench, "the state intends to show that Mr. Rhodes has known associations with individuals connected to gang activity in the Claiborne area. While he has no official record, there's a pattern here that warrants concern. There was no evidence offered. No names, no photos, just shadows stitched together with insinuation. And in this courtroom, that seemed to be enough. Imani waited until he sat down. Then she rose slowly, carefully, her voice calm. "Your Honor," she said, I request that the defense be granted full access to the forensic report on the recovered weapon chain of custody fingerprint analysis and ballistic confirmation. The defense has received no documentation to verify the prosecution's claim. Judge Griggs didn't look at her. He shuffled a paper on his desk, then let out a sigh like her presence was the inconvenience, not the accusation. The firearm was found in the trunk of the vehicle your brother was operating, Miss Rhodes. We're not here to chase ghosts, Imani replied. With respect, the car wasn't registered to my client, and no fingerprints were found on the weapon. That's in the initial arrest report. Griggs finally looked up, but not at the file, at her. What I see, he said, slow and deliberate, is a woman trying to dress up street noise in courtroom language. Then came the line that cut the room in half. Legalese from someone who shops for justice at the discount aisle. It hung in the air like a bad smell. You could almost hear the shift in the gallery. A few short chuckles. One cough that tried to hide a laugh. They weren't loud, but they echoed in the way silence does when nobody steps in to break it. Darius didn't move, but something in him sank. He had heard this before, not in words, but in tone, in posture, in rooms where no one said the quiet part out loud. He thought having his sister next to him would make this easier. But now, seeing her dressed down like that in public by a man in a robe, he felt helpless again. Like a child watching an adult pour shame into someone he couldn't protect. He stared at the table, blinking hard. He didn't say a word, but she noticed. Imani didn't flinch. She stood straight, hands gently folded in front of her, eyes forward. Her face was still, but something deeper stirred behind her calm. Objection, she said softly. Commentary from the bench is inappropriate. Griggs smirked. Sarcasm isn't illegal, Miss Rhodes. She didn't look away. Neither is respect. That hit differently. The prosecutor glanced down at his file and shifted in his seat. He wasn't about to challenge the judge, but his eyes said enough. He hadn't expected her to stand that firmly, that precisely. And suddenly, this didn't feel like a formality anymore. Griggs exhaled sharply. Let's move on, he muttered. One rap of the gavel. Hollow. The kind of sound that's meant to signal control even when it's slipping. From the back row, the man in the dark suit made another note in his book. He didn't shift, didn't blink, didn't even look interested. But his pen paused for just a second longer than before. Imani returned to her seat. Her silence wasn't submission. It was strategic, and the weight of it filled the room more than any outburst could have. Darius turned to her. You okay? He whispered. She nodded without looking at him. This is the easy part, she murmured. And for a moment, Darius believed her, or at least wanted to. He breathed slowly, trying to take in some of her calm, trying to remind himself that she wasn't just his sister. She was someone who knew how to carry fire without letting it burn her fingers. The judge continued flipping through his papers, but something in the room had shifted. His jokes weren't landing. His voice no longer filled the space. Even the court clerk paused longer between keystrokes. And Imani, she sat back in her chair, composed, unmoved, but not unaffected. Because in rooms like this, you don't win by shouting. You win by not folding. And though no one in that courtroom knew it yet, she wasn't just defending her brother. She was preparing for something much larger. And the last time someone underestimated her like that, it didn't end well for them. That night, long after the courtroom lights dimmed and the whispers faded into dark parking lots, Imani sat alone in her small apartment just 2 blocks from the courthouse. The lamp on her desk cast a soft amber glow across the open folder in front of her. It was thick, over a decade old, but every page still breathed with heat. Not from anger, from memory. She reached for the top sheet and paused. Her hand hovered mid-air, fingers stiffened just slightly, as if the paper might still bite. Then gently she turned it. Photos. Statements. Names she hadn't spoken aloud in years. And there it was again, that ache. Not the kind that throbs in flesh, but the kind that takes root in silence. The kind that sits beneath the surface until someone like Griggs says something stupid and smug, and suddenly the wound pulses again. Her eyes traveled across a document marked confidential. Internal review. The ink had faded, but the betrayal hadn't. Once, she wore a badge. Not just carried it, wore it, owned it, believed in it. She was one of the youngest field investigators in the Atlanta office, and the only black woman leading a joint corruption probe into rogue federal agents. They called it Operation Latchkey, meant to unlock a network of money laundering that ran through law enforcement from county to capital. She remembered the day it turned, the moment when the agent she trusted most, a man she'd once mentored, handed over her field notes to a U.S. attorney under the table. They told her the operation had been shut down, said it was too unstable. No proof, no traction. But 2 weeks later, the people she was investigating got promotions, and she got reassigned to a desk with no clearance and no cases. She hadn't even fought it. Not then. She'd thought if she stayed quiet, stayed clean, maybe justice would correct itself. But justice doesn't move unless someone shoves it. Her hand dropped to her lap, and her sleeve slipped back just enough to reveal the small scar above her wrist. Barely visible now. But she remembered how it got there. A night op gone sideways. A target she shouldn't have been chasing alone. Her backup never arrived, not because they were late, but because they were never sent. She'd told herself it was an error, that someone missed a radio call. But when she returned to HQ the next day and found her report missing from the system, she stopped lying to herself. They hadn't forgotten her. They'd abandoned her. And now, years later, she was back in a courtroom. Not as an agent, not even as a lawyer of reputation. Just a woman with a folder and a brother who couldn't afford anyone else. She looked up from a file, her gaze catching on the blank wall across from her desk. But she wasn't seeing drywall. She was seeing a man in a robe sitting on a bench he didn't deserve, smirking at her like she was an uninvited guest in a room she helped build. Judge Griggs reminded her of every man who'd smiled through a lie, every superior who spoke to her like she should be grateful just to breathe the same air. And when he'd said, "This isn't your kind of courtroom," she hadn't heard just a personal insult. She'd heard history. She closed the file softly, pressing both palms flat on its surface like sealing a wound that had been reopened just long enough to bleed again. In that moment, something in her spine straightened. Imani didn't come back to court for closure. She came back because someone needed to finish what they all tried to bury. And if that meant standing in front of Griggs day after day, fielding jabs and facing dismissals, then so be it. No one else in that courtroom knew her story. Not the bailiff, not the jury, not even Darius. He only knew pieces, the honorable parts, the surface. He didn't know about Latchkey or the calls that never came, or the badge that burned her skin even after she took it off. But the audience, the people listening now, they could feel it. They could sense it in the way she didn't flinch, didn't shout, didn't run. They could begin to understand that silence wasn't weakness. It was memory. It was weight. It was choice. And when Imani looked at Griggs in that courtroom earlier that day, really looked at him, what she saw wasn't just arrogance or ignorance. She saw a thread, a piece of the same cloth that tried to undo her years ago. Only this time she wasn't walking away. This time she wasn't alone. They called him like he was just another name on the sheet, Kyle Edmonds, to the stand. But the way Kyle moved, you could tell he wasn't ready. He stood there a beat too long, like a deer caught halfway across the road, unsure whether to run or freeze. The bailiff gave him a nudge with his eyes, and Kyle finally shuffled forward. His sneakers squeaked slightly on the polished floor, just loud enough to remind the room how quiet it had gotten. He looked young. Not just in age, young in spirit, like someone who'd never been in a courtroom before and never wanted to be again. His eyes darted around, landing on the prosecutor for a second, then sliding off like they'd touched something hot. When he sat down, he clung to the edge of the witness chair like it might tip him out if he let go. Imani rose slowly from her seat. She didn't say a word at first. She just stood there watching Kyle. Not pressing, not accusing, just watching. Then she asked softly, "Kyle, you said you saw my brother Darius on the night of October 12th. Is that correct?" Kyle cleared his throat. "Yes, that's what I told them." Imani nodded, took a few steps forward. Her voice remained low. "And what exactly did you see?" Kyle blinked. "Someone running, out of the alley, holding something. I couldn't see what." "Could you see who?" He hesitated. It was dark. But the detective, he said they had Darius, that he'd already confessed. Imani's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did he?" Kyle looked confused. I don't know." She took another step. Her tone sharpened just a notch. "Let me ask you a simpler question, Kyle. When you said it was Darius you saw that night, was that the truth? Or were you repeating what someone else told you? Now the room went completely still. Kyle's lips parted, then closed again. His knee bounced once under the chair. He looked at the prosecutor again. This time the man didn't meet his eyes. Imani waited, just long enough for the pressure to stretch taut. Then she asked, "Did you see, or were you told what to see?" "That did it." Kyle's voice broke. "Detective said it had to be him," he admitted. "Said I'd be in trouble if I didn't back it up." Gasps, low ones, sharp inhales, a ripple through the seats like a dropped stone in water. Judge Griggs slammed his gavel hard. This witness is not qualified to speculate on legal, but Imani cut in calm and cold. "He's not speculating, he's confessing. There's a difference." Griggs pointed a finger. "You're out of line, Ms. Rhodes." Imani turned to face him, voice still level. "And you're out of order if you think threats against witnesses are just part of the game." Griggs banged the gavel again. "That's enough." Imani didn't flinch. "Truth doesn't always sound polite, Your Honor. But it still belongs in your courtroom if this even is your courtroom." Silence slammed down like a curtain. The jury stared. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, but the power in the room had tilted. For the first time since the trial began, Griggs looked like he'd lost control of the rhythm. Kyle sank lower into his seat, but when he glanced up at Imani, there was something new in his eyes. Not fear, not shame, relief. Imani stepped back slow and measured like she hadn't just torn a hole through the prosecution's main witness with a dozen carefully chosen words. And behind her, Darius sat still, hands folded in his lap. No smile, no nod, just quiet. But in his eyes was something solid, something that said, "We're not alone anymore." The judge cleared his throat, voice quieter now. "Let the record show that the witness's last statement will be reviewed." But no one was listening to him anymore. The courtroom had turned. And Imani, she didn't need applause. She didn't need praise. She had the truth. And now the truth had a voice. The courtroom hadn't moved in nearly a minute. No papers shuffled. No chairs creaked. The truth Kyle dropped still echoed in the silence like a bell that refused to stop ringing. He sat hunched on the witness chair, eyes down, hands clenched between his knees. But then, slowly, he looked up at Imani, not like a man facing an attorney, more like a boy remembering something from a different time, a time before fear started choosing his words. "You probably don't remember me," he said, voice rough around the edges, "but I remember you." Imani didn't answer. She tilted her head slightly, giving him space to speak without pressure. "You came to my high school," he continued, now speaking to the room more than the court. "There was this program, Justice Prep. You talked to us about the law, about standing up when it's easier to sit down." A faint murmur stirred in the back rows. Some of the jury leaned forward. Kyle smiled for the first time, but it was tinged with sadness. "You said, truth is louder than fear. It just needs someone brave enough to say it out loud." He paused. "I forgot that, until today." There was a beat, then a single clap. Soft, slow, one person. No one could see who started it. Maybe someone in the third row, but the sound cut through the still air like a match catching flame. Griggs shot to his feet, gavel slamming so hard the microphone squealed. "Order. This is not a theater. Sit down and stay silent or I'll clear the gallery." The clapping stopped immediately, but the moment had already happened. Something in the room had shifted again, and not even the judge could put it back where it was. Imani didn't flinch. She didn't look at Griggs. She just stood there watching Kyle. Her expression unreadable but warm in a way that wasn't easy to fake. And then she smiled. Not a grin, not a smirk, just a slight lift at the corners of her mouth, a quiet kind of knowing, not victory, just connection. She turned away and walked back to the defense table, her footsteps light, steady. She didn't say a word, didn't need to, because every eye in the room had just watched a crack form in the wall they thought would never break. Back at her table, Imani sat down slowly. Darius leaned over just enough that she could hear him whisper, "You used to do that in classrooms." She nodded once. "Every Thursday." He let out a breath that sounded like it had been locked up for years. And in the back row, that man in the dark suit, the one who hadn't moved since the trial began, finally shifted. He adjusted his cuff, leaned forward, and for the first time nodded slowly. No one else noticed. But Imani did. She felt it. It wasn't approval. It was acknowledgement. Something had started. And everyone in that courtroom, whether they knew it or not, had just taken one step into a story that no longer belonged to the judge or the prosecution or even the charges themselves. It now belonged to the truth, and the woman who dared to speak it. The file slipped slightly from Imani's hand as she reached across the desk. It was nothing, really. Just paper, just movement. But then her sleeve caught the edge of the folder. The soft, navy cotton pulled back for a second, and under the courtroom lights, something flashed beneath her wrist. A scar. Long-ridged, unmistakably earned. There was a pause, short but sharp. One of the younger bailiffs near the wall squinted, leaned over to his partner and murmured, "That's a Kevlar burn. You don't get those from filing paperwork." The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. Whispers like that ripple. At the bench, Judge Griggs froze. He didn't speak, didn't sneer, didn't even blink at first. He just stared like a man remembering something he wasn't supposed to. Then came the words, low, unsettled. She wasn't supposed to come back. Imani didn't react. Not with her face, not with her voice. She calmly lifted the file again, smoothed the edges, and placed it squarely in front of her. But the air in the room had shifted. Because that scar, that one accidental glimpse, had said more than words ever could. From his seat beside her, Darius leaned in his voice just above a whisper. "You told me you walked away from all that." Imani kept her eyes forward. She took a quiet breath, let it settle inside her chest, then said so softly, it almost didn't register. "I thought I did." And that was the moment the courtroom stopped seeing her as just another woman in a simple blouse defending her brother. That was when the mask cracked, when doubt turned to curiosity and curiosity to concern. In the back of the room, the man in the dark suit who had sat still for most of the proceedings uncrossed his arms. His posture changed. Not relaxed, not tense, just alert. He didn't nod. He didn't speak. But his eyes now never left her. Griggs reached for his water glass. His fingers trembled against the rim. He cleared his throat and said stiffly, "This court will come to order." But no one had disrupted it. No one said a word. Because now the silence had changed. Where it once meant disinterest, now it carried weight. Where it once allowed bias to speak unchallenged, now it made space for something deeper, recognition, perhaps even fear. Imani remained composed, but her stillness wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't about holding back. It was about preparing. And everyone in that room, from the jury to the officers lining the walls, could feel it. A woman near the back shifted forward slightly in her seat, as if trying to get a clearer look. A juror stole a glance at a fellow panelist, but quickly looked away. Even the court reporter had stopped typing just for a second, like her fingers were waiting for permission to move again. And in that charged stillness, the questions began quietly, internally. Who is she really? What did she give up? What is she still carrying? Because it was suddenly clear, this wasn't just about Darius anymore. This wasn't just about a gun charge or some shaky witness testimony. This was about a story unfinished. A past that refused to stay buried. And maybe, just maybe, this woman hadn't returned for justice. Maybe she had come back for a reckoning. There comes a moment in every courtroom when silence says more than shouting ever could. And that moment came just seconds after Judge Griggs leaned forward, his voice low but heavy with disdain. "You people," he said, each word landing like a stone, "always think you can twist the law to fit your anger." The gallery stilled. You could feel the oxygen vanish from the room. Someone inhaled too sharply. Another shuffled their foot, then froze. Everyone heard it. Everyone understood exactly what you people meant. But no one spoke, until Imani stood. She didn't rush. She didn't yell. She rose like someone who had stood in front of power before and no longer feared it. She looked the judge dead in the eye and spoke with the kind of stillness that can crack walls. "We don't twist the law," she said softly. "We hold it to the mirror and remind it who it belongs to." Griggs jerked back slightly, his lips curling. "This isn't a classroom, Ms. Rhodes," he spat. "This is a court of law. You're not here to teach lessons." Imani didn't blink. "No, I'm here to remind you of the one you forgot." Behind her, Darius shifted just an inch, but enough for two bailiffs to move toward him. He lifted his hand slightly, not in defense, just in instinct. "Back off," he said, voice tight. One officer grabbed his arm. "Sit down. He's not resisting." Imani snapped. He's reacting like any man would when his name's being dragged through the dirt. The officer didn't let go. Darius's voice cracked. "This ain't justice. This is theater." Griggs slammed the gavel. Order. But the order was gone. Whatever hold the judge had, it snapped the moment he opened that door with those 2 words, "you people." In the front row, a woman whispered, "Did he just say that?" while a man near the back muttered, "You hear it clearer when they stop pretending." Clarice Hanley. The assistant DA shifted in her seat. She didn't speak, but something in her expression changed. Not confusion, realization. Discomfort. Imani stepped forward. She wasn't asking anymore. "Let my brother go," she said, calm but final. The officer hesitated, then loosened his grip. Griggs stood halfway from the bench. "This court is spiraling because of your theatrics, Ms. Rhodes. If you can't control yourselves, don't you dare," Imani said, her voice low like a warning wrapped in silk. "Don't you dare call my defense of the truth theatrics. That's what you call it when people like me speak up. But if I wore your robe and your skin, you'd call it principle." The words stung. You could see it in Griggs's face, not just anger, now exposure. The room tilted, not physically, but emotionally. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone felt it. Clarice slowly stood up, all eyes turned, but she didn't interrupt. She just looked at the judge, then at Imani. And then she sat back down without saying a word. Imani turned back to the bench, voice quieter now. "This isn't just about my brother anymore. This is about what you said in front of everyone. About who belongs here. About who gets to be heard." Griggs didn't answer. For the first time, he couldn't. Somewhere near the rear, a single clap echoed. One, then another. It didn't catch on. It wasn't meant to. It was just enough to say, "We see what's happening." And in that moment, the story stopped being about Darius. It became about something larger. The courtroom hadn't just shifted. It had cracked wide open. Imani had barely returned to her seat when she felt it, movement subtle but deliberate. From the far end of the gallery, the man in the dark vest finally raised his hand. Just a flick of the fingers, almost like brushing away dust. But to Imani, it was thunder in silence. She didn't look back at him. She didn't have to. She simply nodded once slowly, like someone who'd been waiting for that moment all day. Judge Griggs, still visibly unsettled, cleared his throat and gripped the gavel tighter than before. "This court," he began, voice rising to reclaim the ground he felt slipping beneath him, "is adjourned for the day. I see no reason to continue this circus. The state has made its case. I'll render judgment tomorrow." He reached for the gavel, but Imani stood again. "Your Honor," she said louder than before, not asking for permission. "This time you can end the hearing, but not the truth." He froze, mid-motion, eyes narrowing. "Sit down, Ms. Rhodes." She didn't move. "You've tried to silence it all day. You've mocked it, twisted it, buried it under your tone and your robe. But justice doesn't retire early just because it makes you uncomfortable." There was something different in her voice now, less restraint, more gravity. The air tightened. Griggs opened his mouth, maybe to issue a warning, maybe to call security, but he never got the chance. Because the courtroom doors swung open with a heavy echoing bang. 3 figures stepped inside in near-perfect formation. Dark suits, calm strides, and badges drawn. The crowd turned. No one breathed. The lead agent, tall, sharp-jawed eyes steady, stepped forward and lifted a folded document. "Judge Albert Griggs," he said, voice firm but even. "By order of the United States Department of Justice, you are under arrest on federal charges including obstruction of justice, civil rights violations, and abuse of judicial authority." Griggs blinked, gavel still in hand. You can't be serious." The second agent stepped beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're very serious, sir." Gasps rippled through the room like aftershocks. A man in the second row stood, then sat again, unsure whether to applaud or flee. Even the bailiffs stood motionless, no longer sure who they were supposed to protect. Imani didn't move. She just watched, eyes quiet. Griggs tried again. "This is outrageous. This is my courtroom." "No, sir," the lead agent said as he stepped closer. "This is the people's courtroom, and they've been watching." He turned, and for the first time his gaze fell directly on Imani. A slight nod passed between them, no longer covert, but earned. And just like that, Everything Imani had held back for years, every betrayal, every silence she had endured for the sake of survival shifted into clarity. This wasn't revenge. This was repair. Griggs's voice cracked now. Who put you up to this? Who? The lead agent didn't answer. He didn't need to, because the answer was already standing there, calm and steady, with truth on her side. And for the first time since the trial began, the courtroom wasn't just watching Imani. They were with her. The noise didn't swell. No cheers, no chaos. Just stillness. The kind that comes not when justice is delayed, but when it finally arrives. The silence that filled the courtroom after the FBI agents entered was unlike anything I'd ever heard in a place meant for words. It wasn't the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was the kind that swells with tension, the kind that warns something irreversible is about to happen. Judge Griggs, who had ruled the room all morning with arrogance and unchecked power, stood up so abruptly his chair scraped loud against the floor. His face flushed red, not just from anger, but from something else now creeping in. Fear. And yet he still barked like he was in control. "This is my court!" he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of a truth he hadn't prepared for. That's when Imani moved. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She stepped forward with a calm that was louder than any gavel, reached into the inside pocket of her blazer, and slowly pulled out an object worn around the edges like it had lived through fire and rain. She placed the old leather-bound badge wallet squarely on the judge's bench directly in front of him, and then looked him in the eyes, not with rage, but with the steadiness of someone reclaiming what was stolen. "You made it yours," she said, voice low, even. "I'm just taking it back." A gasp swept across the courtroom. One of the officers guarding the door straightened as if he recognized the badge before his brain had even caught up. A reporter's pen stopped mid-sentence, and from the back, someone whispered her name like it had been pulled from Legend Agent Rhodes. Griggs didn't speak. His mouth opened, but no sound came. His eyes darted between the badge the agents now flanking him and the room that once fed off his authority, now frozen in disbelief. Then the lead agent stepped forward. He didn't need to raise his voice either. "Judge Everett Griggs. He said you are under arrest by federal warrant. Charges include obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial power, and conspiracy to suppress federal investigation." Griggs backed up half a step, hit the bench behind him, and instinctively looked to the prosecutor's table. But no one moved. The district attorney stared straight ahead, pale and still. Even the bailiff turned his eyes away. One of the agents pulled out the cuffs. "Hands, please." Griggs lifted them slowly, like a man walking through a dream. He tried to speak, maybe a protest, maybe a denial, but nothing coherent came out. Just a weak breath as the cold steel wrapped around his wrists. He looked at Imani one last time. But there was no pleading in that gaze, only the dawning realization that the courtroom he'd twisted into his playground had finally outgrown him. As they led him toward the side door, heads turned, not in pity, but in stunned silence. Darius, still seated beside his attorney, blinked hard as if trying to reconcile the woman he called sister with the badge that now told a story he never fully knew. The agent walking behind Griggs paused beside Imani and gave a subtle nod. "Your intel was dead on, Agent Rhodes." She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply exhaled a deep breath held far too long and let her shoulders settle into a kind of peace that only comes after walking through fire and knowing you didn't let it burn you hollow. No one applauded. No one needed to. The room didn't belong to Griggs anymore, and everyone knew it. The courtroom was quiet now, not by order, but by awe. The chaos had passed, but something heavier remained in the stillness. Imani stood motionless as Griggs was led out in cuffs, the sound of his shoes scraping against the marble floor trailing behind, like a final echo of his power slipping away. Cameras didn't flash. No one cheered. The silence itself bore witness. Darius stood slowly. The chains were gone from his wrists, but the weight on his chest hadn't fully lifted. He walked over to his sister, his eyes searching hers for something that wouldn't come through words. His hand found hers, and for a moment he just held it, tight. Not as a brother freed, but as a boy reminded he was never truly alone. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice catching like it wasn't ready to be heard. "For not letting them define me." Imani looked at him, and something in her softened, not crumbled, but unguarded. She reached up to adjust the collar of his shirt the way a big sister might do before picture day. Then she leaned in, her voice low. "That's the whole fight," she said. "Not letting them define us. Not today, not ever." The courtroom door creaked open again. This time it wasn't the FBI or reporters or security. It was just a slow wave of people exiting, many of them pausing as they passed Imani. Some nodded. One woman placed her hand over her heart. A man in a deputy's uniform lowered his head slightly as if in apology for something he couldn't name. Outside, the press gathered hungry for the next headline. A young reporter called out, "Agent Rhodes, are you returning to federal service?" Imani didn't flinch. She glanced up just enough for the sun to catch in her eyes. Then she smiled, not with triumph, but with something quieter. "No," she replied. "This was personal. They wanted more." But she didn't wait for follow-ups. She didn't linger in the sound bites. She simply walked down the courthouse steps, her heels tapping steady against the stone, the rhythm calm and even, like someone who'd long since stopped needing the world to clap for her steps. At the bottom of the steps, Darius caught up to her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. He walked beside her, a free man now, not because she fought for him, but because she reminded the world he was worth fighting for. And somewhere behind them, inside that now quiet courtroom, the air still hung heavy with something unspoken. Justice hadn't screamed that day. It hadn't worn banners or thundered through microphones. It had simply stood up quietly in the form of a woman who knew what silence had cost her and chose never to pay it again. Because sometimes justice doesn't need a podium, just a memory, and someone brave enough to stand in it. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it walks in quietly through the strength of someone who refuses to let silence win. This story wasn't just about one courtroom or one man being falsely accused. It was about the power of truth, the cost of dignity, and the courage it takes to stand, especially when the system expects you to kneel. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel something deep down, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel, Mr. Max Stories, for more powerful narratives just like this one. Your support isn't just a number. It tells us these stories matter. It gives our team the strength to keep writing, keep digging, and keep bringing you voices that refuse to be silenced. Because here at Mr. Max Stories, we don't just tell stories, we remember them, we honor them, and we pass them on. Thank you for listening.